Okay, are we ready to go? Brilliant. Well, a very good morning, good afternoon to you all, depending on where you are, or good evening, in fact. My name is Rohanna Mikhail, and I am Director of Creative Economy at the British Council, and I'm based in our headquarters, and I'm speaking to you today from our offices in Stratford. A very warm welcome to all of you. For those of you wishing to access captioning, you can do so either via the closed captions button in Zoom or via the link which is being pasted in the chat now by the team, I hope. I ought to also describe myself to give a visual description. So I have quite messy, long, curly hair today. I'm wearing black, I have brown skin, and that's pretty much all you can see on the screen. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the first in a series of 3 international leadership conversations titled Adaptive Leadership and Planet. As an alumni of a leadership course which has been led by the British Council, or CLAW Leadership, you're part of a powerful network of leading in the arts, culture and creative industries across the globe. We're operating in a time of great change and uncertainty, of shifting contexts and demands on us as leaders of people, of places, and ultimately of our shared planet. In this context, we wish to understand better the common threads of leadership, learning that would best support our alumni. As well as hearing from inspiring panelists, we hope this session will provide an opportunity to meet and explore leadership, learning needs with your global peers and help us better understand common threads and inform future leadership support. So this for us is very much an opportunity to open up a dialogue around this particular theme, but to look specifically at leadership within that dialogue. So before I go on, I must go through some housekeeping. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute. And if you would like to raise a question, please raise your hand in the chat or put a note in the chat function if you have a question to ask, and the team here will help to ensure your question reaches me. Please name yourself, especially when we go to the parts in this session in the breakout groups, so that we can, and we also invite you to include your pronouns. And also please say your name before speaking, because that will help with the captioning. This session is being recorded. So now let me introduce Kate Atkinson. Kate, maybe you could give us a wave and say hello. She is the Head of Programmes at CLAW Leadership Programme, and she'll give a brief audio description of herself and some background. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much. So a very warm welcome. I'm Kate Atkinson, Head of Programmes at CLAW Leadership. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, and I'm sporting a lovely pair of chunky headphones today, talking to you from the CLAW Leadership office. So, as Rihanna introduced, this is a really exciting partnership for CLAW Leadership, and we're really excited about the potential, the tantalising potential here for leadership conversations between our 2 sets of alumni, those of the British Council programming and also those of CLAW Leadership. We're really excited about where synergies, difference and kind of diversity within those conversations exists, and what the potential is around leadership learning going forward. So, as has been introduced today is the second of 3 conversations around different themes to do with leadership. And we're really curious about the conversations that will happen today and where they may go on. And going forward from these 3 conversation pieces, our next steps will be to convene and to commission some small pieces of leadership learning activity. So really today we're interested in starting to explore with you where future leadership learning around this theme may exist and how we might respond between British Council and CLAW Leadership. So I'm going to hand back now, but I shall be here throughout the session, so happy to kind of chat with folk and happy to hear from you about where this conversation goes next as well. So back into the main conversation.
Thank you so much, Kate. So before I introduce the panelists, I just want to remind us of this theme. So it's Adaptive Leadership Planet. How can we lead with a global context in mind? What is the role of culture and cultural diplomacy in a world facing global challenges, global inequality, and an uncertain future? The time that we're living in at the moment has changed so much. So much has happened in terms of conflict, in terms of a global pandemic, and in terms of how people have changed the way that they work, how they interact with each other, perhaps even the way that they lead, and how they prioritize certain issues in their life, whether that's family life, work life, or whether it's how they live in their community and how they contribute to that community, and what their role is in terms of climate change and sustainability. Since returning to the UK, just for those that don't know, I've worked for the last 3 years in China. I was based in Beijing during the time of a global pandemic, which was a very unusual, interesting, and fascinating, transformative experience, actually. And prior to that, I've lived and worked in the Middle East. So I've had very different international experiences. And I very recently returned to the UK, and I've seen so many changes. I can honestly say that I don't go through a single day where the word climate is not used in the context of the changing nature of what's happening to our world regarding climate change. But I mean, let's face it, Brits do like also talking about the weather an awful lot. But given climate change is a global emergency, and the exchange of information between different cultures and regions of the world becomes crucial for climate mitigation. I work in the field of cultural relations, so I work with countries around the world. The British Council works with over 100 countries. And so the work that we do gives us an opportunity to be able to engage with people like you and to learn from people working in different parts of the world about how this issue is being spoken about and how this issue is being woven into policy and how this issue is being woven into perhaps places and boardrooms where decisions are made that affect people's lives. For me, the answer very much rests with inclusive leadership and community. We're a global community going through an enormous challenge, and the time that we're all living through has the potential to be a time of unity and a time of common purpose, which for me, the eternal optimist, makes me feel hopeful. So that's my sort of 1 minute's worth, but I won't keep us any longer because I really want to get into the meat of the conversation, which is with our 2 panelists. And so let me just take a moment now to introduce our 2 panelists. So we have with us today Ananya Bhattacharya, a social entrepreneur specialising in gender, culture and sustainable development, and an electrical engineer from Jadavpur University and a Commonwealth Scholar with a Masters in Sustainable Development from Staffordshire University. Ananya is co-founder and director of Bangalantak.com, headquartered in Calcutta and working across India for inclusive and sustainable development using culture-based approaches since the year 2000. A very warm welcome to you, Ananya. Our second panelist today is Syed Jazib Ali. Jazib is a documentary practitioner with a sharp eye for human interest. His work focuses on global advocacy projects that help bring inclusive sustainability, societal equality, and fair human rights. A very warm welcome to you as well, Syed. So maybe we could ask the panelists to introduce themselves and to give a visual description before they then touch on the topic. Maybe we could start with you, Ananya.
Hi, namaste. I'm from Eastern India. I'm an Indian and I'm brown with black hair and I'm wearing specs and I'm wearing a traditional sari. I'm wearing a black sari and a white blouse, and I look forward to today's discussions.
Thank you, Ananya. Jazib.
Hi, I am Jazib, and I work as documentarian campaigner in human rights and sustainable advocacy for different global organizations, and I'm a panelist here today. I'm a brown man in his late 20s with straight black hair and a strong black beard, sat in front of a white wall, and I'm from Jammu and Kashmir in India.
Wonderful. Welcome very much. Welcome to both of you. Okay, so let's kick off with a conversation about the theme today, which is focused on leadership and focused on planet. So maybe, Ananya, you've probably thought about this. I hope you have. And we could perhaps kick off with some of those questions around what do you think it takes from a leadership perspective to think about this issue of changing nature of humans' relationship with the planet? I don't know if you heard my question there, Ananya.
I missed a part of it, but I guess what you said, but I need someone to, share my presentation. I think.
Brilliant. Okay, we have some visuals on the screen.
So I'd like to start by thanking British Council and the CLOR leadership for inviting me to this wonderful debate and dialogue. Next, please. Next, please. So indeed, as we have been discussing, we are living in a very complex world where we are facing the disasters of climate change, the vagaries of changing weather. We are seeing political turmoils, we're seeing wars, we're seeing loss of traditional heritage, the challenges of homogenization, and we're seeing a lot of inequality, the widening gap between the haves and have-nots. So I'd like to share from my experiences of working in the sphere of culture and development. Next, please. I run a social enterprise, which I co-founded in 2000 called banglanatak.com. And our work is about synergizing, safeguarding of cultural heritage and fostering inclusive and sustainable development. So our flagship initiative, which is called Art for Life, it has worked towards identifying and strengthening local traditional cultural skills as resources for sustainable income generation. We realize that poverty is because of lack of employable skills. Where there is no agriculture or industry, there is poverty and there is unsafe migration. But we also realize that we have a rich base of cultural assets. So in 2004, we started working on revitalization of oral and performing art traditions. And we challenged the conventional view that urban conurbations is the answer to national economic growth. And rural heartland is merely, a provider of labor. Today, Art for Life covers around 60,000 artists. They're musicians, dancers, craftspersons, weavers, ranging from the deserts in the west of India to the deltas in the east. And what has happened today is a rejuvenation of the cultural heritage as well as local growth. Here you see Tajkira, who is an expert of a embroidery tradition called Kantha, which is simple run stitch. Around 10-15 years back, she was the first woman from a village to step out. And today she has traveled internationally, acclaimed for her work. This year she won from the prestigious Indian Institute of Management the Star Entrepreneur Award for leading more than 500 women. So in her villages today, embroidery symbolizes independence, financial security, self-fulfillment. The mothers, they were illiterate, but their daughters, they're completing school education, they're pursuing masters in college education, and they have this aspiration of running fashion business. So creative entrepreneurship in our journey, what we have realized, brings together social, cultural, and economic values. So our key learning is a tradition bearer or the cultural worker, as we say, has to be the protagonist who will ensure their rights, who will safeguard their heritage, and who will get access to the moral and material interests and benefits which arise from protection of cultural heritage. So in our AFL approach, we had focused on bringing strong cultural identity and developing villages as cultural hubs through community museums, festivals, and so on. Next, please. So I'll today share how, multicultural exchange collaboration, contributed Conventionally, folklore or folk performances are considered to be lost genres of art, and the dynamicity of creativity is lost, and so they often have static attributes, stuck in time. Even in crafts, we see there is a tendency of homogenizing the product lines to achieve some global standardization on design vocabulary. And the rural artist, because of a wide range of factors, are delinked from the buyer, from the audience, from the consumer. This results in various challenges, and I think cultural exchange plays a critical role in bridging this gap. So in the last 10, 15 years, we're thankful to a wide variety of multilateral organizations, government, cultural institutions who have provided us funding support. Here you see, for example, rural traditional musicians called Bauls from West Bengal. They have co-created music with a Russian band and they're performing. In the other, you see an online heritage education program. A young woman who is a storyteller come a scroll painter, she is teaching children in a school in USA how to paint narratives and how to sing them. So cultural exchange builds bridges, we all know, it promotes diversity, but it empowers and it creates new possibilities. Thanks to the digital inclusion, which happened before the pandemic, these communities, they could survive the pandemic. It provided them resilience because they could reach out to audiences through the internet and continue earning. Next, please. As I said, festivals are immensely powerful, and we need to design our festivals with all the challenges in mind. We started our flagship World Peace Music Festival, Sur Jahan, in 2011. And our main aim at that point was to promote the Baul and Fakiri tradition in West Bengal, which was relatively unknown in the world Sufi music festivals. And the festival created a platform. And today, the average age of Baul has decreased because the young men and women, they realize how this music tradition not only propounds a love for humanity, a very important philosophy of life, but also enables them to reach out to audiences across the world. So in this festival, we have consciously designed the festival so that it becomes a platform for inclusion, a platform to network, to reach out to new audiences, a platform to promote diversity. We invited musicians, we focus on traditional folk music, world music, and we invited musicians from Burkina Faso, from lesser known small countries. We invited women from Iran, women from Morocco. And there was a festival which focused on women. You see the musicians from Iran singing here. You see the Baul woman here in the other photo. So this festival has over the years created new opportunities for the artists. Next, please. The power of culture, the soft power of culture, all of us who are in the world of cultural programming, we all know it is immensely powerful and it creates new opportunities. Here you see the team from Burkina Faso, and this traditional musical instrument that was not known. Over the years, we have realized through the festivals, even the folk instruments, they got rejuvenated and new folk instrument bands, a new kind of music got created. Next, please. We are living in a very interesting times. It is the culture. We are in the age of supra-diversity. Because of globalization, because of migration, every country has diverse communities. And thus today, cultural pluralism, cultural diversity, building bridges, building mutual understanding, finding commonalities are all extremely important. And that is where cultural diplomacy plays the role. Today, for example, this is another photo from the same event, and it's a team from Sweden. And now music from Sweden is not necessarily Swedish music. He's showing music from Western Africa, a dancer from Greece, and Ale Moller, he's a very renowned Swedish musician. So we are all coming together with new identities. Next, please.
Ananya, you've got 4 minutes.
Yeah. 2, you said?
1 more minute to wrap this.
So, you know, what is the provocation I'd like all of you to think through is now all of us know the power of culture. So we are discussing the post-2030 agenda. As we know, the SDGs, they have set 17 goals for sustainable development where culture is not really there. It is there somewhere mentioned in a target for education, in a target for protection of natural and cultural heritage, in a target for jobs through cultural tourism. But the cross-cutting role of culture across food, across health, across disaster prevention, across peace building, this is not recognized. So how we can influence, I think that is what we all need to consider. Next, please. So how we can relearn from heritage. Indigenous communities worldwide, they are still living schools of sustainability, and they use their backward biodiversity from food. Here you see a community who are making a food called Run Bang from the bark of trees. And this is a very remote area in India, in Arunachal Pradesh. And it is often cut off due to heavy rains and floods and for extreme weather. And then this Run Bang has become the food during the famines, during when there's no access to the outside world. The other one shows a site in UNESCO tentative list. It's about the agricultural practices of the Apatani community, how their knowledge of biodiversity, natural resource management helps them to sustain in very extreme conditions. So how we can learn from our traditional heritage. Next, please, to find answers to today's problems. I think what we all need to discuss is how cultural and natural heritage can become real public goods for facing the developmental challenges today. You know, this folklore is a powerful narrative traditional. You see here Bonbibi Pala, which is about, you know, the lady of the forest. It is practiced in the Sundarban Delta, which is the largest mangrove. And traditionally, it speaks of, you know, protecting natural resources, protecting biodiversity. During the cultural tourism, indeed, that has become a very powerful tool during the pandemic when the world could not board a train or a flight. People took cars and went to the vicinity, and this village-based tourism again provided resilience to the artist villages, which were already prepared. I'd also like to mention here about the International Council of Monuments and Sites, who have come out last year with their new charter on cultural tourism, which focuses on, you know, considering cultural and natural heritage as commons, move away from the economic angle or solely economy-driven model of development to one which is focusing on equity, on participation, on transparency, and also addressing climate change. Next, please. So the time has come that we are all together. You know, I was just thinking of We Are the World. It's almost 40 years now when, you know, they really gave us the lyrics, I think. The lyrics, if I remember, we are the world, we are the children. And the change can only come when we stand together. Yeah, right? So I think how as leaders in the cultural world, how we can build evidence, we all know, but how we can build evidence to influence public policies, to influence programming. In the SDG, it's a huge challenge that there's not enough data and how we can influence the policy makers. I think that is the challenge which we have, where we all need to come together and let's have more festivals. It has not been happening. And after the break of pandemic, I think we need to have another cultural extravaganza to highlight the power of culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. A very diverse presentation covering so many points. You talked a little bit about cultural exchange, you talked about soft power and diplomacy, you talked a lot about festivals, and you also spoke about food being made from tree bark, which is utterly fascinating. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about your journey in terms of where you are now and this work that you are doing, you must have come across people that inspired you. You must have come across leaders that had a really clear vision, that put a light bulb on in your mind about what you needed to do and how you needed to act in relation to climate change and the work that you're doing now. So can you tell us a little bit about those leaders that inspired you and how they affected the work that you're doing now?
You know, my main experience in my journey in 23 years as a social entrepreneur, working in the realm of culture and sustainable development, is the leaders from the community. I learned so much from them. So I gave the example of one of them, Taj Kira, who I told about her story of how she changed the status of women in her community. So in all these communities, there are fascinating examples of women and men who are really in their own way identifying the problems, finding solutions. And we as an organization, as a social enterprise, we really played the role of a catalyst, the role of a facilitator, by connecting them directly to national and international forums. So the leaders who inspired me are the leaders from the community. I'll tell you of another girl. You know, there is a vigorous dance called the Chow dance. And this is traditionally a male dance. And this girl, when she was 12-year-old, thought, why can't girls dance? And she started dancing, and we helped her in getting the training. And that was also thanks to a funding support from a photojournalist from Germany who is visiting the villages. And today there are 15 girls Chow dance groups in that. So I think one big role of culture is it develops and inspires leadership. Leadership is something, I think, which is nurtured, and all we need to do, and culture is a powerful asset. You know, it is a process and it is a resource.
So that's a great answer, Nania. I'm going to double click a little bit on this point that you've made about leaders in the community being the ones that inspired you. Can you say a little bit more about the attributes that they had, that you would class them as being leaders in their field? What sort of attributes did they demonstrate? What sort of, personality came across? What made you gravitate towards them?
One thing is, the leaders, they innovate all the time. They find answers to the solution. And I think they're very calm, they do not encourage conflict in any way. They try to resolve, they try to bring people together. When we had the pandemic, for example, many of these rural artists who are quite renowned, thanks to years of work, which we have done and other people have done in India, as you know, there are many such stories. But the market was disrupted and they had no access to any market opportunity. So many of them invested that time in their own creativity. So I think that is one great attribute, they find engagement and culture. One big power of culture is it provides engagement. We have found that in very poor areas, there is no unsafe migration if the cultural identity is strong. People, despite poverty, despite all the problems, they stay in the village and they try to work out and evolve solutions. So that way, cultural identity, the pride in its own culture, all these are important parts of that leadership development.
Okay, so you've talked a little about your kind of local context, but also from your biography, you studied sustainable development at Staffordshire University. So can you say a little bit more about the kind of leaders and the people that you came across there and their sort of vision of the world from that perspective?
I'll then just give some more background about our global work. One is, of course, the cultural exchanges and collaborations I mentioned, but we are also accredited to the UNESCO 2003 and 2005 conventions, as NGOs with advisory status. And this has really given me the opportunity to work with other cultural organizations who are using culture as an asset for development. So when we started our journey, maybe say 2010 timeframe, if we think of, then still that time, culture was very much part or very much important only for aesthetics. You know, people went to cultural performances, saw culture, appreciated culture, researched. But, you know, the development paradigm came in much later. And I have learned a lot from these other organizations. Many of them are from Europe, are from Africa, are from other countries in Asia, where I have learned, you know, how to come together, to evolve a consensus, to find ways to influence policies, to influence programming, to influence international dialogue. I think that is another important attribute.
And Ananya, I'd like to ask you about, from the angle of leadership, your influencing skills. How did you influence people and how did you get them to come along with your vision?
I think the idea is to demonstrate. You, as Gandhiji has said, be the change you want to see, right? So I think, you know, you have to practice that and people will just come together. I mean, there is no 1, 2, 3 steps, but I think being sincere, being honest, being transparent, being open to other viewpoints and trying to understand other viewpoints, these are all very important.
Brilliant. Before I move on, I'd like to ask you a question about India being holding the presidency for the G20. There must be many conversations going on in many circles at the moment about what that presidency means for India and what sort of platform opportunity that creates for leaders, obviously, that will be congregating in India to have, you know, discussions at the highest level. So what's your take on that? And what would you kind of want to put on the table, on that big G20 table, from the angle of climate and sustainability?
I have participated in some of these conversations, both from culture as well as gender, which is another topic very close to my heart. And I'm really very happy that I find that, you know, this has been a very long process of deliberation. Like there are programs happening all across with all the countries coming in and recommendations coming up. And then, you know, the final recommendations will be going in September. So one very good thing is, you know, like when we were talking of gender, the role of women in managing this traditional cultural knowledge that got recognized, the power of the traditional knowledge in harnessing development as well as contributing to climate change, that has been part of the dialogue, the importance of creative economy as a sector, and all the challenging issues about artist rights. Today, we didn't get time to discuss those, but as you know, when we talk of cultural diplomacy, but artist rights and artist status are still big areas of concern internationally, right? So I think all these have been part of the dialogue, and that has been a very fascinating experience.
Okay, well, and we will have time in the breakout a bit later to unpack some issues that you've raised. You've raised many brilliant ones, so thank you very much. I'm going to move along now to Syed Jazib Ali to talk a little bit about his work. Over to you, Jazib.
Hi, Rahana. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'll start with climate justice. What does climate justice stands for? Climate justice aims to achieve a sustainable social structure that advocates for the underrepresented and marginalized communities to voice their struggle. For me personally, my background, born in a rural village on the front lines of India-Pakistan conflict, I experienced the oppression and alienation stemming from belonging to an underrepresented Pahari community, an indigenous Pahari community of Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir. Early on, I have witnessed how without a leadership structure and unity among the indigenous population, The authorities have successfully plundered the resources with mining and hydroelectricity projects in the name of development. And now new mining projects like the discovery of the lithium mine can further push the ecologically sensitive area and ecologically fragile area into an environment catastrophe. And we have witnessed how mainstream media have throttled my community's voices and how authorities have suppressed our agencies over the time, just because there was no proper leadership structure among the indigenous population and there was no such unity. Can one individual make a difference? A single individual cannot change the world, but they can catalyze the forces that can. The power of ideas, initiative, and enterprise stemming from one person is enough to create ripples, making way for collective waves. So I was part of this project at COP26. One of the examples, I was a co-director of ACNO film, and then I was invited as a panelist there. And this is one of the powerful examples of what one individual can do. I can recall as it was followed live by hundreds of people from my community back home. For many of them, it was their first exposure to climate change. And yeah, the film, this film that we made at COP26, it was post-COP. A lot of people like from my community, the tribal Paharis and Kashmiris reached out to me in person and on social media. And many started taking an active interest in sustainable farming and agriculture. They even started asking me questions about what climate change is. And I know some of the young people who actually formally took the climate change education. And for me, that felt like, a chain reaction of some leadership skill that I didn't even recognize that I had in that influence on my community and specifically the young people. How one person can set off a reaction in terms of inspiring. Let's see the full screen here, sorry. Yeah, so the collective pride in seeing me represent young people on a global stage made me realize how one person can set up a chain reaction in terms of inspiring others. And another leadership example, what does it mean is, for me, leadership means carving out a space for people from marginalized backgrounds to hold power accountable. And one of the examples is a short documentary that we did. It was a documentary on a landmark feminist resistance movement led by Muslim women of Shaheen Bagh in Delhi against the Citizen Amendment Act, CAA, of the Indian government. The film came with its risks since last sections of the Indian state-controlled media, mainstream media, portrayed the protesters as anti-nationals and some even denouncing them as terrorists. And yet our film managed to create dialogue about representation and dissent in a democracy. It also highlighted the Muslim women protesters by amplifying their otherwise marginalized voices and sparked a conversation of state versus minorities globally in different film festivals, in different human rights events in Europe, in Americas, in Latin America, and also in India. For the underrepresented minorities at receiving end of the law, the short documentary fulfilled on essential public information function. And this is where I see the importance of alternate storytelling platforms and advocacy, slow advocacy, where the mainstream media fails to deliver these kind of platforms and formats. They act as public information where others fail to. I have been recently part of this Creative Climate Leadership Program by Julie's Bicycle. It took place in Belgium in March. It's a program that brings together artists and cultural practitioners to the concept of climate justice. It creates a space where we learn and relearn the concepts of sustainability and the role of culture in making a fairer and just society. And for me, personally, it was the experience that was very thought-provoking, self-reflectory, and it kind of helped me in breaking the constructed barriers and looking at things with a fresh and different perspective. Like for people in my community, the most crucial challenge is to overcome the systemic barriers we face regarding knowledge and access and understanding. And my creative climate leadership journey made me reflect on the power and privilege we hold and the importance of acknowledging that. I realized And it was a collective realization that we all realized that we all have that power on different levels and that privilege over something or someone. For example, I realized the influence I have on my community, and the young people and the people there in the course realized what kind of influence they have, or the privilege being from a particular race or a particular community, from a particular sector. And this was a very interesting and reflectory session, that how we can use our privilege in the whole climate justice movement to act on it. And it all starts with identifying and acknowledging it. The climate justice movement is all about equality and the fight against injustice. And for this, we need to put ourselves out of the box and start looking at things critically with a solution-oriented approach. And I think that is one of the very key skills of leadership, the solution-oriented approach. And I have few provocations that I was coming with, like self-reflectory, that I would like to say, I would like to mention is, and this is also I shared in the Creative Climate Leadership Program, and it was very interesting to see what people think. That are we empowered to hold power to account truly? What is our moral responsibilities when it comes to world? What are the moral responsibilities when in a world facing challenges, inequality, and an uncertain future? And the role of alternative storytelling platforms when mainstream media fails to misrepresents the minorities. And with this, thank you. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jazib. Very, very interesting take, particularly from a filmmaker and documenter. Before we move on to Q&A participants, I just got one question to ask you, because you talked very briefly about storytelling, and I'm curious to know your take on how people respond to apocalyptic, devastating images of climate change versus how they respond to stories of human nature. You work in the visual realm. What works best in terms of helping people to understand what's really going on and the role that they can play?
One thing I've realized, which is very interesting as well, specifically after I moved to UK and I've been living in UK now, I realized that the West holds the power in terms of, you can say, the colonial roots or the economic power or the political power, but the countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Asia, they do actually, the audience here care about what, the governments care about what the people there think about them. And somehow I realized when I was talking about human rights and things happening here or things happening far away, as a storyteller, it didn't feel like it was reaching with that kind of impact to the audience in the West, in England. And I realized with climate change, it started, because it kind of felt like for the audience, the threat was on their doorstep, and they kind of reacted more to it rather than people dying far away, the more human rights. So it kind of made me feel like, as a storyteller, that how people have become more desensitized to things that are happening far, far away, because of, a lot of news, seeing dead children from Syria, dead people from Yemen. So it is also a part of another thing, that how people got desensitized. But now, when I see even these important things, when you want to advocate for, let's say, human rights, it kind of works when you put the climate change and the environmental angle, that something like what is happening in Amazon can affect you tomorrow in England. And that is where I saw that, the power of storytelling, if you weave through specifically climate change, has more reach, and specifically in the West.
Okay, thank you, Jazib. I'm going to try and open up for questions for people who are joining this session. There's a question that's come from Robin. I don't know if you're still there, Robin, but I'm going to read your question. Your question is actually to Ananya. And you say, Ananya mentions that the development paradigm came later, but it would be helpful to know why and what the blocks or delay were. Ananya, can you see that question in the chat? you able to answer?
I just answered. Actually, you know, there was a lot of concern because artist rights, artist access, all these were not well defined. So there's a lot of worry that commercialization will lead to misappropriation. It will lead to loss of the meaning and the value. So the potential of living heritage and the creative economy based on living heritage was not realized because of these apprehensions. And in general, creative economy, the power of culture, you know, in terms of that, is not much understood. There's not much defined policy. India does not have a creative economy. You know, today technology is bringing forth immense potential. As Jazib just shared, you know, the power of media. But if you look at our digital policy as a country, it does not mention the power of that digital technology and the creative economy. There's no mention. So, you know, there's lack of understanding, and we all need really to work together to raise our voice. And I think that is one big characteristic of leaders, as you were focusing on that, that we really need to come together, identify the issues and do the advocacy.
Thank you, Ananya. So picking up on that point, maybe Jazib, you could respond to this one while we wait for any more questions coming in from people online. I can't see any hands raised. I wanted to touch on the point of collaboration, which was something that both of you mentioned. And when I think about what's going on in this shared global challenge of climate change, you know, by all humanity, you know, across the world, this is our planet Earth, and all of us living on it have affected where we are today. But it's also down to us to try and tilt differently to resolve this challenge that we're all facing. So what does collaboration in leadership look like? Could you say a little bit about that, Joseph?
So recently I was at this United Nations Water Conference in New York in March, and it was first in 50 years. And there was this, one of the entrepreneurs, he was talking as a panelist, and really like what he said. He said, it's not just the global North and South partnerships, what we need, it's also the South and South, because the solidarity movements that, you know, by identifying that, okay, this struggle, I can identify with that, we have similarities, but every, you know, this movement needs its own unique solution. So sometimes what we end up doing is like a copy paste solution that, okay, we identify or we relate to this struggle or this movement, so we can copy paste it. For example, something happening in North, we can copy paste in global South. I think that doesn't work most of the time. So collaboration for me as a leader is, you know, taking inspiration, but creating your own unique solutions.
Brilliant, thank you, Jazib. And Ananya, you also mentioned quite a bit.
Building evidence. I'll also talk of the next step. Of course, I agree fully with Jazib, but you know, we need to build evidence, you know, the hard evidence that this works. Culture, the role of cultural diplomacy, the role of culture in addressing the challenges, both conflict as well as climate change. You know, it's very extremely important. We all need to come together. I think that is one very important area where we need to work together.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm looking over to see if there's any further questions that are coming in from any of the alumni. Has anybody got any questions who's tuned in today?
Yeah, there is a question for Jazib.
Ah, okay. Robin again. Okay, so there's a question for you there, Jazib. One question is from Martin, another one is from Robin. So let's have a look at Robin's question first. The misrepresentation by media, is it media alone misrepresenting, or does this go beyond? And for both of the panelists, how helpful has it been having a large Indian diaspora when it comes to blended heritage? Maybe Jazib, you could have a go at that one.
It's very interesting that I recently have been part of this campaign called 2 Billion Strong. 2 Billion Strong is a UK Euro-based campaign, a climate change campaign, and it aims to put the Muslim voices in the center of climate change. And I realized like there were like 10, 12, we were young Muslim people from different backgrounds. But I realized I was the only one not born and brought up in UK. And I could see, and which is very interesting, that how the struggles that I identify with are very different from the diaspora. I do relate to them, but then again, coming straight from Jammu and Kashmir and going to the UK, I see that there is still that kind of distance and a difference in making the diaspora understand the struggles, immediate struggles that I have been through, and even understanding there, because they are on a different level. They understand the, let's say, British society even better than me, the core problems, race, ethnicity, and I have a different experience to those. So that's one thing very interesting. And the question of misrepresentation by media, is it media alone misrepresenting, or does this go beyond? So I think media is a very important factor when it comes, like the whole role of media is to counter these narratives, but when it kind of becomes a tool for these narratives, that's a big problem. Specifically what is happening in India at the moment, the global rank also went down. 2 days ago, there was a report, it's on 161 now, the media freedom. And that's when, you know, it's called the chilling effect. When the state media and people, they see that if they speak against the government, there's some kind of going to be a political vendetta against them. And that's what happens, they kind of become submissive. And in India, it's a very horrible state at the moment in terms of media. It's literally a state tool. And that's when I said that alternate storytelling platforms have this importance. That's when they come in, because when we made this film, let's say that's with Shaheen Bagh, later on we were approached by many even researchers, students that have started doing their PhDs in just Shaheen Bagh movement. So this became and they reached out to us that they want to take the reference as the film as this important reference for their research project. And more we realized that how these kind of work, they might not have an immediate and bigger impact, but in the longer run, when we say slow advocacy, they do matter a lot, because where the mainstream media has failed, these kind of stories and documentation help us preserve. And the next question, sorry, do you want to lead, Rehana? I hope, Robin, like if you have any other questions, please let me know if I missed something.
Robin, I hope that answers your question. And Martin, I hope that also answers your question. Do we have any further questions from our alumni? Okay, so there's something coming in. Oh, you know. Okay, that's all I have. I don't see any hands raised. Okay, maybe I could throw in another question related to change and how leaders can drive change in the area of climate change. And I'd like you to talk, if you have any examples, just briefly, of where you've seen great leadership in terms of making change happen. Maybe Ananya, you could comment on that.
Since we are talking about, indigenous people, we are talking about climate change, I'd like to share about communities in Arunachal Pradesh, where I worked last year. I worked extensively. So, an excellent example of is, the cultural heritage commons. I think we all need to think of changing ways things are governed, what we call today polycentric governance, that it cannot be top down. And we all understand it's impossible for multiple stakeholders to be always connected. So the networks have to have multiple centers. So here there is a community who are known as Bugun, and Bugun leocicla is a rare bird which was spotted a few decades back in one of these hills of Arunachal Pradesh. And the community realized, that their biodiversity was endangered. And so they earmarked around 17 hectares of land, square kilometers of land. This is in West Kameng, Singchung in Arunachal Pradesh. And they declared it as the Bugun Village Community Reserve. And they protected the biodiversity. And that bird and the community, they have the same name. I think it's a lovely example of community leadership. And I agree with Jazib that we need to create multiple platforms where these stories are told. And today technology gives us the power. Our states all across the world is a problem, not only in India. Our states try to control the narratives. But technology is immensely powerful and we can have multiple narratives. And because of marginalization, because of isolation, because of exclusion, many of our indigenous communities, they do not know how. And as leaders, I think we have the challenge of, reaching out to them and evolving with them the answer to their problem. They will have to evolve. They will have to find the solution, but we can bring in experiences. No solution in one part of the world will be exactly fit in another part of the world. But, we need to share our learning. I think that's the most important. And I'm really happy that this dialogue is happening. And over the years, British Council, Claude, you have provided these wonderful platforms. UNESCO has been providing this very important platforms. I'm really thankful to them also. I think this dialogue needs to be stronger and stronger.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nanya. We're rapidly running out of time now, and we need to move into some breakout groups. So before I hand back to Kate to go into the breakout groups, there's just something I wanted to mention that I think may be of interest to our alumni, which is that the British Council has published a whole series of little reports and some research. And I think maybe someone could, maybe Kate, you could post in the chat the link I shared earlier, but there are a lovely little series of publications that look like this. And they are all focused on climate and cultural relations. They are a very thorough read for anyone that wants to have a bit of a reading list after this session. So I'd like to thank Ananya, and I'd like to thank Jazib, and I'd also like to say I would love to have a longer conversation with you again, both. I think that you're covering approaching the topic in very different ways. And I think that you both demonstrate excellent leadership in doing so. So I really enjoyed meeting both of you today. So I'd now like to hand over to Hilary, because I believe we've now reached a point in the agenda where we are going through to a break, or is it into the breakout rooms?
Thank you, Rehanna. Thank you for asking questions which made us reflect.
Thank you, Rehanna. Thank you, Ananya and Jazib. And I think you're all staying with us for the second part of the programme, which is fantastic, because we can then have more intimate discussions with you in the breakout rooms. So my name is Hilary Jennings, and I've been working with British Council and CLAW on mapping of the alumni programmes of the two organisations, with a view to these pilots that we're going to develop, which this next part of the conversation will be part of helping shape. I'm a 60-year-old woman. I'm a white woman with very short fair hair and wearing a blue top. We're going to move shortly to the next stage of the discussion, which will allow us to talk together with the peers in the room and with our speakers and panelists in two breakout rooms, two programme breakout rooms. But before we do that, I'm going to suggest we have a brief comfort break of 5 minutes. So if we could come back at 37, whatever your hour is, in 5 minutes time, we will join those breakout rooms and we can have a chance to speak together. So see you all in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Session. What we're going to do in the second part of the session is we're going to have two discussions, one following from the other, and we'll be in small breakout rooms, and you'll stay in the same room, so you'll be with the same people. The first discussion is going to be really just talking about what you heard from the speakers, what you heard in the conversation and the questions, and thinking about what the common leadership challenges will be in respect of cultural leadership and planet. And then we'll come back into the plenary session. We'll come back together. We'll hear from what's being talked about in the groups. We'll share that knowledge, and then we'll go into a second breakout room where we'll talk about what kind of leadership development might we need? So the first part is really just talking about really what we've heard from first the really inspiring speakers and the interesting conversation that we've just heard. And the second part will be looking at leadership challenges. So I put some instructions in the chat. We'll be in about 3 groups, I think. And if you could self-facilitate, I was joking with someone saying if a group of leadership alumni can't self-facilitate some breakout rooms, I'm sure you're all perfectly capable of doing that. And if possible, if you could assign a scribe or somebody just to feedback notes at the end. Ideally pop them in the chat, but we'll hear from each of the groups when we come back together. I've put the 2 questions. So what resonated from you from the provocations and the conversation, and what are the common challenges that you see in relation to cultural leadership and planet? We'll have about 15 minutes, and what I'll do is I'll put notes in the meeting chat telling you the timing, so you'll have reminders of when you're due to be back in the main room. Is everybody okay with that? If so, I will invite Lucy to open up the breakout rooms. I hope that was a useful conversation. And I hope you found a scribe to feed back. We had 2 groups, so it would be good to hear something from each of the groups to share a little bit. If you can share in the chat, that's great, but it would be good to hear in the room what each group was talking about. So is somebody ready to do a bit of feedback from either of the groups?
I'm happy to feedback from the group that I was in, Hilary.
Thank you, Johanna.
So there was some really, really good points made. One of them was about sometimes people who are in positions of leadership and are therefore in positions where policies can be made and change can be made, are coming from a place of not coming from that particular area, don't have technical expertise in that area, because those positions are high-level government positions. And so they are coming from a completely different area, and they're put into this portfolio, which actually isn't their specialism. So therefore, they don't have that deep-rooted understanding of it. And that can be a challenge for others who are seeking to influence those leaders. That was an important point that came up in the group I was in. Another important point that came up was around value systems and beliefs. And someone in the group mentioned the urgent need to develop a different narrative, because the current narrative just isn't working, it's not resonating enough. So thinking about leadership going forward, there needs to be a much more sort of holistic approach around tackling people at different levels. I don't know if anyone else from my group wants to comment on that. One final thing that came from my group was around being diaspora in the UK, in being studying in the UK, and the experience of being from a different culture and then coming to the UK and studying in the UK and actually trying to navigate how people perceive you and how your ideas are therefore interpreted in a different global context, different country context, I should say.
Thank you, Rohana. That's really, really interesting and really useful to feed into the next conversation. Is there anything could we hear from the other group also, so we get some?
Yeah, with the caveat that we didn't assign a scribe at the beginning of our discussion, so this is done without notes. So if the other people in the discussion have kindly offered to help me if I omit details. So I'll do my best to summarise. But Martin had quite an interesting reflection on the difficulties with building trust with communities, particularly if you're not part of that community, and wanted to kind of learn a bit more from the speakers about how one can do that and build relationships. Is that right, Martin? Good summary?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we had a bit of a discussion about the sort of Eurocentrism of the climate conversations, just riffing on what Jazib was saying about how he was really surprised to find that he was the only person in that 2 billion group that was not from Europe. I was just reflecting on, it seems that there's really different dynamics and the discussions that are happening around climate change, particularly around COP, in Europe being about like we need to reduce as quickly as possible, and then countries from the developing world kind of being like, well, we need to grow, and we need to grow in a fair way. You've already burned quite a lot. So the kind of climate justice elements, and also some people even maybe being quite resistant to the idea of climate change as being this is a way that you're stopping us developing and preventing us from having wealth, and how do we incorporate those things in our cultural leadership, I guess. And Met was also reflecting on like the difficulties in working with Grey-eyed, like a lot of the people that she's working with are just have so many different challenges going on in terms of like cost of living crisis, and like the very like insecurity, like domestically, like how do you engage artists and audiences effectively when, you know, their concerns are so pressing. And I guess, you know, that probably is presumably echoed across all the countries that are represented here. Is that a good summary of everything? Does anyone want to jump in with anything I've missed?
Yeah, Kate speaking here. Till, you missed something that you raised right at the beginning of the conversation, which was around media. I don't know if you could say more about that as well.
Oh yeah. I really like what Jazib was saying about like alternative, maybe less used ways of storytelling and getting and media's being able to kind of cut through mainstream bias. And I thought that was really interesting. I had a bit to reflect on in terms of my industry, like actually what other platforms or ways of telling stories might be out there that might have less dominance, that might be able to get something more interesting out there, or a bit more you know, sort of counter to the main narrative. So yeah, that made me reflect. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you. That's great to hear from the two conversations. I'm hearing themes around cultural practice in terms of connecting with community, in telling different stories, and this sort of, when I think about the tantalizing potential of the cross-cultural and cross-context cultural conversations that a group like this could have, and the tension of the day-to-day and the what's happening in your context and the immediate that we're all at different scales dealing with, and that tension, you know, how can we keep talking and how can we keep communicating and putting this in the center of the cultural conversation, but at the same time recognizing that that's not always possible for everybody, even the best of us to focus on. I'm going to suggest we go into the final breakout room, where we're going to look at specifically what leadership development and support might help, having had those thoughts. What could we do? What might a pilot look like that would bring together alumni or could support alumni in this frame? So Lucy, if you could pop us back in breakout rooms, and again we'll have about 15 minutes, and I will give you a time note so you'll know how long you have. See you all shortly. Welcome back, everybody. So it will be good to hear from each of the groups what thoughts you had around leadership support in this framing. Would anyone like to start us off? Ananya.
We had very good points. The first point was, you know, finding the right people to the table. You know, we need to be conscious that whether the voices of the right people are being heard. And the examples were, you know, so often it is very tokenistic representation. The next was, you know, the whole challenge of diaspora and learning to act in a certain way when you are living or studying in another country, and lack of cognition to the fact that the other world might be thinking in a different way. So we all need to open our minds, which I really said when I was speaking as one big part of leadership. The third point is how to develop this ecosystem of leadership so that from the communities which are affected, they can come forward Now, one of us felt that cultural diplomacy should be the main pillar of action here, but some of us disagreed, and we feel that, you know, even the cultural knowledge and the creativity, they are the assets. So one is the soft power and one is the assets. Both need to be, you know, taken care of and nurtured and developed. And I think these are the broad points. Anything else? There was some talk on IP, which is one of my very favorite issues. We really need to do a lot of things in that part.
I didn't catch that last sentence.
IP, you know, decolonizing the understanding and, you know, intellectual property rights, the whole narrative is different, you know, say even taking consents and all these, you know, cultures are different. And often because of our colonial history, often, you know, the way things are done are very, you know, the North oriented, while maybe rest of us may be thinking in a completely different way.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Ananya and your group. If anyone else wants to add anything, or we could hear from the second group.
Just to let you know, Kate's just dropped out of Zoom, so she was going to feed back for her group. So if anyone else wants to step in while she's just logging back in.
I can try again if people are happy to help. We talked a bit about like the oh, Kate's back. Kate, can you help me? We talked a bit about the kind of we talked about the importance of like a holistic leadership, like and having leaders, artistic and cultural leaders from across like a diverse range of backgrounds who are understanding of the sort of like the broad issues at play, and representative of, you know, the people they're making work for, and also have a kind of broad range of skills and sort of essentially, I think I'm summarizing Rehana's point right, is just rounded human beings who are like, you know, compassionate and aware of all the various social issues that we're dealing with. Is that representative, Rehana, broadly? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, I think you're doing a good job. I think the point that I made was around how much the world has changed through people expressing vulnerability. I spoke about, you know, topics such as mental health being spoken about more now, and people being more confident to talk about that in different parts of the world. And I also spoke about the sort of spectrum of, you know, people being perhaps driven by targets, deadlines, and bottom line commercial, you know, drive. And actually, how can we find leaders for the future that are so good in what they do that that people gravitate towards that way of being, which is a way of being that is collaborative, a way of being that is inclusive, a way of being that is globally minded and not narrow-minded, and a way of being that is intergenerational and can think about what I do now in this privileged position of leadership is going to affect generations down the line, because I'm here in this point on a history timeline, making decisions, doing things, supporting others to do things that actually are going to affect people much further down the line. I need to take responsibility for that. How can we support a cohort of leaders that think in that way?
So yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. That's a lot better than what I said. So yeah, that we talked about that, and we also talked about the kind of in terms of like climate change, how the big challenge is really a challenge of imagination, or at least for us, because I made the point that basically it is politicians that are ultimately going to prevent, like, to find a solution, if there is a solution that's going to be found before it's too late. But for those of us who live in democracies, we do have some kind of connection to those politicians, and that's through the consciousness of the people that we are with. So I don't really see any role beyond raising consciousness. I think that's probably the best thing that we can do and the most useful thing that we can do. But the difficulty in terms of culture about climate change, I think, is that a lot of, like, certainly I work in the theatre industry, and a lot of theatre shows about climate change are kind of notoriously boring and uninteresting, and people really turn off. And even really, really talented theatre directors are unable to make really exciting, brilliant work about climate change. I'd actually challenge anyone to name me a really like amazing like piece of like imaginative fictional work which is dealing with climate change, which is just really good, not just because of what it's saying about climate change, but really artistically good. I haven't come across one yet. I'd love to hear anyone, if anyone has heard of those things, but I think it's a gap of imagination. And it's partly because the stuff is so dry often, like the facts and the sort of, but we as cultural leaders need to find ways of making that capture the imagination of like the voting public, so that they are, they're really inspired to pressure their politicians to make decisions that we need for our planet. So I guess the thing I was asking about is, is there a way of bringing together scientists, social policymakers, like artists and activists, in a way which can upskill the sort of like creative leadership? And Martin also was speaking to that kind of thing of like how in Uganda, like there is just this this difficulty in engaging people with climate change because of all the other things that are going on, and so to inspire people to think about and take action on climate change when there are just so many other concerns and material concerns is really challenging, and that is an imaginative task, an imaginative leap that we need to make, and that's hard and not that easy, and perhaps support with that might be really useful. Is that a good summary, Martin?
I'm happy to add something.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, thank you. So I was looking at how we can actually create languages that communities best understand, because you discover that in Uganda or in Africa, most of the communities are less educated, or they have less access to knowledge. And this is something that Jazib had talked about. When you talk about climate change, it's more of a theory, it's more of a myth, it's more of something that hasn't come yet. Many people are seated on a time bomb, but they don't know actually that it's something that is already going on, and it needs a gradual process of sort of a solution. However, our governments are still also reluctant about these sorts of narrative. So in our discussion in our room, someone raised and said that actually I think she thinks that we need influence the big and powerful organizations that have a voice come in and create those programs that are going to be supporting directly the individuals, so that we communicate, we sensitize, and create the awareness about a particular global challenge before people actually take it for granted and think that, because I know that in most of the narratives, if I can just take us back to the pandemic, in Uganda, we used to hear that it's in China. It took about 3 months to arrive in Uganda, the COVID-19. And we were all saying, those are sicknesses of the white people. And it was a widespread myth. And no one knew that actually an African was going to die until actually people started seeing their relatives losing lives. I don't want us to remember all those memories, but it is kind of complicated in our communities for people to understand. You will discover that actually not more than 20% in Uganda are literate. So what is about the 80%? Not the statistics that are given in the figures for political reasons, but on ground, out of the 46 population, for 46 million population, how many people actually access information, knowledge, and understand and are ready to contribute to the global fight? So the best languages that we can communicate may be through the cultural performances, so that they can articulate articulate the climatic change effects and all that through culture, through people get on board. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you, Tyrell, and others for feeding back in. That one of the things that really strikes me from this is the need to keep the channels of communication, to build the channels of communication of all the different perspectives and the context that we have, because the key, what I kept hearing people talking about, understanding that it might be different from a different perspective, is a really essential role for culture and perhaps for us as global cultural leaders. I'd love to carry on, but we have 3 minutes, so I really have to close the session. So I'm going to just briefly let you know 3 ways that you can keep engaging with this conversation, because this is just really building up to developing the pilot leadership projects. First of all, you can either attend there's 3 sessions in this programme. This is the second, and they will all be shared as recordings. So you can sign up, if you could drop the link in the chat, Lucy, but you can sign up to the 3rd session, and you can also sign up to get videos of the other sessions. For each session, there is also a post-event form, which you will get emailed for this session. And that's an opportunity for you to really, if there's something you said or heard that you would really like to make sure is recorded in the future planning, you can put whatever you want in that form. So this is an opportunity, you've had this conversation, but you can feed in very specifically your thoughts on that form. And you can contact us directly on programs@cloreleadership.org. So we're really very, very grateful to Rehana and to our fantastic speakers, Jazib and Ananya, for really not only giving us great provocations, but also for really engaging in the discussions that we've had in the second part of the session. And I hope that you will all of you who participated will have got something from the discussions, but will also help continue this discussion and help inform the development that CLOR Leadership and British Council go on to do. So thank you all very, very much for your participation. And I think we're just in time to close the session. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. It was very nice discussing with all of you.